actually one of the things that I got the most value of from in reading these books was the beginning of the first book on Peter Lombard, where you discuss the development of theology sort of up until the time of Peter Lombard, and in particular, this development of what we would call, or the seeds of what we would call systematic theology, because of course theology exists from the very beginning. It's present in St. Paul and the very earliest church fathers, but it develops a very different character and perhaps you could say method, if not doctrine, as time goes on. So could you please speak about this? Maybe just give us a bird's eye view of the development of theology for perhaps in a methodological kind of sense and kind of the ethos of it, maybe for the first 1,200 years or so, up until 1,100 years or so.
The development of theology in the West, one should also say,
yes,
because the Eastern development is a little bit different. The development of theology in the West up to the time of Peter Lombard, well, the way in which I presented it in both of these books really is that what happens in the 12th century is a decisive, not so much culmination in the development of theology from reflection on individual truths of the faith to the beginning of an understanding of the field of theology as a whole. So, as you already noticed, theological reflection is not something new in the Western tradition or indeed in the Christian tradition as a whole, East or West. And certainly one can say that theological reflection begins in the Pauline epistles, perhaps begins in the Gospel according to John already.
Yes.
Where we're moving from, and these now are key terms, from narrative, from an account of what witnesses, followers of Jesus experienced and witnessed, to theological reflection upon it, to an attempt to conceptualize, to synthesize already the content of these experiences. I mean, certainly the Gospel of John already moves in that direction, and then the Pauline epistles. What did not happen until really the 12th century, with perhaps a couple of exceptions that one could notice or outliers that one could draw attention to, is the pulling of reflections on individual aspects of the faith, such as what's the relationship between law and grace, what's the relationship between nature and reason, of course. What's the relationship between providence and freedom of the will? These are all topics, and of course many others, that church fathers discuss. If you just think of Augustine as just one example. What doesn't happen for many, many centuries is an attempt to give a systematic, conceptual account of the truths of the faith as a whole. So what doesn't happen is an account of a comprehensive account of the different aspects of the faith. That's to say, one could also say a translation of the narrative of the faith, both in the Old Testament and then, of course, also in the Gospels in the New, a translation of those narratives into concepts, systematically and comprehensively arranged. I'm saying that one could say there are exceptions. I mean, at least I can think of one exception, and that's John Scott's Eriugena with his Periphysion, which is really an attempt to offer an account of the faith as a whole. But that John Scott's Eriugena was a little bit of an outlier, and also due to the fact that he was condemned, didn't exerted only marginal influence on the history of theology in the West. What then happens in the 12th century, for reasons that have been known for a long time, since at least, I would say, the 1940s and 1950s, due to the influence of the development of canon law in the 12th century, where a need arose to move towards a body of canon law that was coherent and consistent, which canon law, of course, regulates the life of the church on the ground, if you will. It has a certain primacy over abstract theology, in that the question as to say, let's say, whether a mass is valid or not, or whether a confession, an act of reconciliation is valid or not, this has immediate consequences for the salvation of a soul. Whereas how I explain the incarnation, if it's still in accordance with the faith, is not something that is of importance for my salvation. It is something that is of importance for my understanding of the faith. So canon law is a certain precedence. And what happened is that canon lawyers began to notice the need to synthesize, because what a particular council had said, what a particular pope had pronounced, what particular theologians held in relation to various matters of canon law was not always coherent and consistent. And so in canon law, therefore, technologies were developed and even methodologically articulated to reconcile seemingly divergent accounts of particular aspects of canon law into a systematic whole. That then influenced theology more broadly as well, and that happened in the 12th century when theologians began to experiment with different ways of systematizing the faith as a whole. Systematizing means questions arose that now seem the answer to which now seems very obvious, but it wasn't so at the time. Questions arose such as, how do we begin? With what theological truth do we begin a statement of the faith as a whole? Do we begin, for example, with Genesis, which would be following the narrative order of Scripture? The first book of Scripture is Genesis, so let's begin with Genesis. Or shall we begin? Peter Abelard was experimenting with the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. Shall we just say, let's try to give an account of the whole of the faith by saying there are aspects that concern faith, aspects that concern hope, faith, aspects that concern charity, etc., etc. So there were experiments along those lines, and Peter Lombard's solution, he used an Augustinian principle, the distinction of things and signs from De Doctrina Christiana to structure his theology. Peter Lombard's attempt to provide a systematic theology turned out to be the most compelling and therefore historically the most successful one. So that's how I present the development of theology in the run-up to Peter Lombard in my two books. I already brought up the notion of narrative. Perhaps another complementary way of talking about this could be adapted from Henri de Lubac, who famously in his book on the Eucharist made a distinction between a symbolic approach to the truths of the faith. Theology itself, as you know, is a historical term, so one could, for example, claim, perhaps paradoxically, that there was no theology in the 12th century, simply because the so-called theologians didn't use this term. They used Sacra Pagina or Sacra Doctrina or something of that sort. But at any rate, let's use this anachronistic term and talk about theology. Henri de Lubac made this very helpful distinction in which he said that up to something like the 12th century, the language of theology was largely symbolic, that is to say, using metaphor, using the allegorical relationship between the Old Testament and the New as a key to theological language as a whole, where then starting in the 12th century we see a movement away from the symbolic language to a dialectical one. That's the terminology that de Lubac used, symbolism versus dialectic. One could say the language of metaphor, the language of symbolism, the language of allegorical interpretation of Scripture is gradually, and then in particular in the 13th century, replaced by the conceptual language of the philosophers, and that language has to be univocal. Because if you want to present a certain aspect of the faith in terms of a syllogism, from X, there follows Y, and so forth, a syllogism requires univocal language. If in my syllogism I employ terms that have several meanings, whose meanings kind of slide metaphorically, that's not going to allow me to build a theological science as Aquinas wants to build. And so I think that's an important key, because it also has, it's a very contemporary way of talking about theology in terms of language, and perhaps it also touches about a contemporary problem. By contemporary, I really mean 21st century. Namely, the question is, what language do we have to speak if we want to convey the Christian faith to a world that perhaps no longer speaks its language. And then, of course, then the question becomes, what is its language? And I would say, well, primarily, it's, of course, the language of Scripture. And only secondarily is it the language of any kind of theology. Which would mean then that we have to give primacy to the symbolic language of Scripture over the dialectical language of theology. But anyway, so perhaps I've already given, or at least I've attempted, of course, to give an answer to your question. Whether it's an answer that you judge to be helpful, that's up to you and your listeners.
Yes, thank you. Well, so I recently read St. Augustine's work on the Trinity. And, one might call it systematic in a sense. I mean, it's there's very logical and it's certainly taking things out of Scripture and kind of putting them in a certain order and incorporating philosophical ideas and things like that. And yet so much of it is still, how do we interpret this verse from Scripture, and do these two verses contradict each other or not, and that sort of thing. So does the development of theological science or systematic theology, let's say, up to the sentences, does that necessarily imply a move away from Scripture, or just a kind of a translation of scriptural language into other kind of language, or what? I'm trying to think about like the spiritual ramifications of this shift in what theology is, or how it's done.
Well, is it necessarily a movement away from Scripture? Yes, though not necessarily in a negative sense. If you move away from, let's say, the narrative order of Scripture, let's look at the narrative order of the books of the Old Testament in order to distill from that an understanding of the relationship between the Lord and the people of Israel. If you try to articulate that without following the precise order of the books of the Old Testament, yeah, it's a movement away from Scripture, certainly, but not in any negative sense, not in the sense of betraying now the sense of Scripture. Things do become interesting when the further and further we move away from Scripture. And again, it's not necessarily in the sense of a betrayal. You already used the term, there are more spiritual ramifications than perhaps theological ones. It's completely possible to present an orthodox, compelling, coherent theology that is spiritually perhaps not very fruitful because it has moved very far away from Scripture.
I see.
And that is, for example, that is one of the reasons why at the time of the Second Vatican Council and in the run-up to the Second Vatican Council, the great theologians of the middle of the 20th century decided that it was time to move away from a type of theology that you can see in Thomas Aquinas, which is very conceptual, which is very logical, which is very scientific. Well, Aquinas tries to build a scientia by his own account, so scientific, of course, not in the 21st century of the meaning of the term, but in the Thomistic sense of the term. But it becomes a theology that whose conceptual language begins to float above Scripture at a significant distance.